The last three beans rattled in Ayanna Whitehorse's trembling palm as thunder rolled across the merciless Arizona desert, but her hand froze mid-count when a gunshot cracked through the dawn silence. It wasn't the distant echo of hunters, it was close, desperate, final. A magnificent black stallion burst through the mesquite, riderless, blood streaking its flanks like war paint. Tallulah gasped, dropping her father's worn Bible, while 9-year-old Nahale scrambled behind their threadbare tent. The metallic scent of blood mixed with desert sage as Ayanna followed the crimson trail with her eyes, knowing what she'd find but praying she was wrong. 20 yards away, a man lay crumpled against a boulder, his expensive leather vest dark with spreading stains. His breath came in shallow gasps that seemed to steal the very air from her lungs. "Mama, we can't," Tallulah whispered, reading her mother's heart. "We don't have enough water left." But Ayanna was already moving, her grandmother's voice echoing like ancient thunder. "Sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing, child. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now." Let's continue with the story. The desert had taught Ayanna Whitehorse that survival meant counting everything. Beans, drops of water, breaths left in a dying man's chest. She knelt beside the stranger, her calloused fingers finding the pulse at his throat, while Tallulah and Nahale watched with the wide-eyed stillness of children who'd learned too young that death wore many faces. "Cherokee," the man whispered through cracked lips, his fever-bright eyes finding hers. "You're Cherokee." The words hit her like cold water. Few white men in Copper Falls knew her heritage, fewer still spoke it without contempt. This cowboy, with his fine clothes and silver spurs, shouldn't know the old language that tumbled from his delirium like prayers from a drowning man. Ayanna Whitehorse had once been the schoolmarm of Copper Falls, back when her husband William still drew breath and their small house held laughter instead of echoes. That was before the fever took him, before the bank took their home, before she learned that a Cherokee woman's education meant nothing when creditors came calling. Now she lived in a patched tent on the outskirts of town, with her 2 children, surviving on odd jobs and the kindness of strangers who were becoming fewer each day. At 30, she carried herself with the dignified posture of her grandmother's teachings, even as her stomach gnawed with hunger. Her long black hair, once pinned in neat schoolteacher's fashion, now hung in a simple braid down her back. The calluses on her hands told the story of washing clothes by moonlight, mending torn fabric until her fingers bled, and rationing their last jar of preserves across 3 growing bodies. Tallulah, 12 years old, with her father's gentle eyes and her mother's fierce spirit, had stopped asking when they could go home. She'd learned to read the desert like her Cherokee great-grandmother had taught, which plants held water, which tracks meant danger. The girl carried herself like a small adult, translating her mother's pride into defiance when the town children whispered squatter and half-breed. 9-year-old Nahale still believed in tomorrow's promises. His Cherokee name meant forest, though he'd never seen trees that didn't struggle against the desert's grip. He carved toy horses from scraps of wood and told elaborate stories where heroes always won and families never went hungry. The boy had his father's optimism and his mother's stubborn refusal to surrender. The stranger's breathing grew shallower as the sun climbed higher, turning their tent into an oven. Ayanna calculated the cost, their last precious water, the herbs she'd been saving for her children's fevers, the energy to tend a man who might die anyway. But as she looked at his face, something familiar stirred in her memory. Not his features, but something deeper. The way he'd spoken Cherokee with perfect pronunciation, the medicine bundle that had fallen from his saddlebag, worked in patterns her grandmother had taught her. "Mama," Tallulah whispered, "what if helping him brings trouble?" Ayanna touched her daughter's cheek, tasting the bitter irony. "Child, we already have all the trouble a family can hold." The stranger's fever broke on the second night, but not before he'd spoken enough Cherokee in his delirium to fill Ayana's heart with questions that had no safe answers. She'd used their last clean cloth to bind his wounds, their precious lamp oil to see by, and water she couldn't spare to cool his burning skin. Tallulah had boiled their final handful of healing roots without complaint, while Nahele kept watch for riders who might come looking for a wounded man. "Water," the stranger croaked as consciousness returned, his voice like gravel scraped across stone. Ayana helped him drink from their dwindling supply, watching his Adam's apple work as he swallowed. In the lamplight she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 35, with the weathered hands of a working man despite his expensive clothes. A long scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, old and silver white against his tanned skin. "My horse," he whispered, trying to sit up. "Dead," Tallulah said bluntly from her position by the tent flap. "3 bullets in him. Whoever was chasing you meant business." The man's face crumpled with grief that seemed too deep for an animal, however beloved. Ayana had seen that look before, on her own face in the cracked mirror after William's funeral. This wasn't just loss. It was the snapping of the last thread connecting him to something precious. "What's your name?" Ayana asked, helping him settle back against their makeshift pillows. He hesitated, his eyes darting between her face and the tent's entrance. "Quinn," he said finally. "Quinn Stonecrow." The Cherokee surname sent a jolt through her. Stonecrow was an old name, one her grandmother had mentioned in the stories of families scattered by the government's removals. But this man spoke Cherokee with the careful precision of someone who'd learned it as a second language, not the fluid rhythm of a native speaker. "You're hurt bad," she said, checking his bandages. "Bullet went clean through, but you've lost a lot of blood." "I have money," Quinn said urgently, reaching for a leather pouch at his belt. "In my saddlebags. Take what you need for supplies, medicine." "Your saddlebags burned with your horse," Nahele interrupted, though his eyes were fixed on the expensive silver buckle of Quinn's gun belt. "Everything's gone except what you're wearing." Quinn's hand moved to his vest pocket, then stopped. Whatever he'd been reaching for, he thought better of revealing it. Instead, he studied Ayana's face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "You're Cherokee," he said again. But this time it wasn't a fevered observation. "Pure blood?" The question carried weight in these territories, where blood quantum determined everything from land rights to social standing. Ayana lifted her chin with the pride her grandmother had taught her never to surrender. "My grandmother was full-blood Cherokee. My grandfather was a missionary who loved her enough to learn our ways instead of trying to change them." She smoothed Quinn's blanket with hands that didn't quite shake. "What's it to you?" "Nothing," Quinn said quickly, but color had risen in his cheeks. "Just, it's been a long time since I heard the old language spoken properly." "You speak it yourself," Tallulah observed, settling cross-legged beside her mother. "Better than most white folks who try." "My mother taught me," Quinn said, then closed his mouth as if he'd revealed too much. For 3 days, Quinn drifted between fever and wakefulness while Ayana and her children took turns watching over him. They rationed their meager food supply to include him, watering down their soup until it was little more than flavored broth. Tallulah foraged for desert plants while Nahele set snares for rabbits that seemed to sense their desperation and stayed well clear. On the 4th morning, Quinn woke clear-eyed and alert for the first time. He watched Ayana prepare their breakfast, 3 small bowls of thin porridge made from their last handful of cornmeal, and his face darkened with shame. "You're starving yourselves for me," he said. "We're sharing what we have," Ayana corrected. "That's what families do." "I'm not family." "Neither was the widow Ruth to Naomi," Tallulah said primly. But grandmother always said love makes kinship, not blood. Quinn stared at the 12-year-old with something like wonder. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She was Cherokee medicine, Nahale said proudly. She could heal anything that wasn't already dead, and talk to spirits besides. Where is she now? Gone to the spirit world 2 winters past, Ayanna said softly. Took the fever same as half the reservation. Quinn's face went pale beneath his tan. The reservation? But you're here, in the territory. Ran away, Tallulah said matter-of-factly. Mama says sometimes you have to choose between following rules and keeping your family alive. Something shifted in Quinn's expression, recognition, perhaps, or guilt. He opened his mouth to speak, then thought better of it and reached instead for his vest pocket. Quinn's hand emerged from his vest pocket, holding a roll of bills thick enough to choke a horse. Ayanna's breath caught in her throat as he peeled off more money than she'd seen since before William died, enough to buy supplies for months, maybe even rent a proper room in town. Take it, Quinn said, pressing the bills toward her. For everything you've done. Ayanna stared at the money like it might bite her. Where did a cowboy get that kind of cash? Does it matter? Quinn's voice carried an edge of desperation. You need it. I have it. That's enough. But Tallulah was studying him with the sharp eyes of a child who'd learned not to trust easy answers. You're not just any cowboy, are you? That vest cost more than most folks make in a year, and your boots are hand-tooled. Real cowboys don't carry that kind of money, unless they stole it. I didn't steal anything, Quinn said firmly, then softened his tone. I own a silver mine about 50 miles north of here. Small operation, but profitable. Nahale's eyes went wide. You're rich? Rich enough. Quinn struggled to sit up straighter, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing wounds. Rich enough to help your family properly. The word family hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Ayanna felt something warm and dangerous unfurl in her chest. Hope. That treacherous emotion she'd taught herself to suppress. Hope led to disappointment, and disappointment was a luxury they couldn't afford. Why were you shot? She asked instead. Quinn's jaw tightened. Business dispute. Some men thought they could muscle me out of my claim. Did they? Not hardly. There was something cold and final in his voice that made Ayanna think this wasn't the first time Quinn Stonecrow had faced down men with guns. But they killed my horse doing it, and that's something I won't forgive. Over the next 3 days, as Quinn's strength returned, he began to prove his claims weren't just fevered ramblings. He knew things about silver mining that only came from experience, the best ways to shore up tunnel walls, how to read ore veins, the market prices for raw silver in Denver and San Francisco. More importantly, he knew how to handle himself like a man accustomed to giving orders. But it was the small moments that began to win over Ayanna's children. Quinn whittled toys for Nahale with a bone-handled knife that looked older than the boy himself. He helped Tallulah with her reading, showing patience that surprised them all when she struggled with difficult words. In the evenings, he told stories of mountain mining camps and silver strikes that had boys jumping up and down with excitement. Tell the one about the ghost mine again, Nahale begged on their 6th night together. Ghost mines aren't real, Tallulah said primly, but she leaned in to listen anyway. Quinn's eyes found Ayanna's across their small fire. Some things are real even when you can't see them, he said carefully, like the bond between people who help each other when times are hard. Ayanna felt heat climb her neck that had nothing to do with the fire. Quinn had been watching her with increasing intensity as he recovered, and she'd caught herself watching him back. It had been 18 months since William died, 18 months of focusing on nothing but survival. She'd forgotten what it felt like to see interest kindle in a man's eyes. On the 7th morning, Quinn made his proposal. Come with me, he said simply. All of you. I have a cabin near my mine. Not fancy, but solid. Clean water, good hunting, and Tallulah could help with my books while you teach her proper. Nahale could learn the mining trade if he's interested. And what would you get out of it? Ayanna asked, though her heart was already racing. Company, Quinn said quietly. It gets lonely up there. A man starts talking to his mules after a while, and they're poor conversationalists. Tallulah giggled despite herself, but Ayanna remained cautious. And if we don't suit? If you decide you want us gone? Something flickered across Quinn's face. Pain, perhaps, or old anger. I'm not the kind of man who throws away something precious once I've found it. How do we know that? You don't, Quinn admitted, but you saved my life when you had every reason to let me die. That tells me something about your character. I'm hoping you'll take the same kind of chance on mine. That afternoon, while Quinn dozed in the shade and the children played with the toys he'd carved, Ayanna walked to the edge of their camp to think. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and merciless under the blazing sun. Somewhere out there was the reservation where she'd grown up, where her people struggled on land that wouldn't grow crops, and with government rations that arrived sporadically, if at all. Behind her lay Copper Falls, where white families prospered while Cherokee families scraped by on the edges of society. And now Quinn offered a third option, a chance at something approaching normal life if she was brave enough to trust a stranger. Mama? Tallulah appeared at her elbow like a shadow. You're thinking real hard about something. Mr. Stonecrow's offer. He's not like other white men, Tallulah said thoughtfully. He doesn't look at us like we're problems to be solved. No, Ayanna agreed. He doesn't. And Nahale likes him. You know how careful Nahale is with new people since Papa died. That was true. Her son had built walls around his heart after William's death, but Quinn had somehow found a way past them with simple kindness and patient attention. What does your heart tell you, Mama? Ayanna almost smiled at the question. Tallulah sounded exactly like her great-grandmother, who'd always trusted intuition over logic. My heart says he's hiding something, Ayanna said honestly. But it also says he's a good man. Then maybe the something he's hiding doesn't matter. Maybe. When they returned to camp, Quinn was awake and packing his few belongings. He looked up as they approached, hope and fear warring in his expression. We'll come, Ayanna said, before she could lose her nerve. For a trial period. If it doesn't work out... It will, Quinn interrupted, his face transforming with a smile that made him look 10 years younger. I promise you it will. But as they prepared to leave their desert camp for Quinn's mountain cabin, Ayanna couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made a decision that would change everything. For better or worse, their fates were now tied to Quinn Stonecrow's, a man who spoke Cherokee like a half-remembered prayer and carried enough secrets to fill a silver mine. The last thing she saw as they rode north was a dust cloud on the southern horizon, moving fast and deliberate toward Copper Falls. Something cold settled in her stomach as she realized that whoever had shot Quinn might still be looking for him. And now they'd be looking for her family, too. Quinn's cabin sat in a mountain meadow like a jewel in a crown of pine trees, with clean water running in a creek beside it and windows that caught the morning light like promises. Ayanna had to press her lips together to keep from crying when she saw it. A real home, not just shelter, with a stone chimney and a covered porch where children could play when storms came through. It's not much, Quinn said, suddenly shy as he helped her down from his borrowed horse. But the roof doesn't leak, and there's a root cellar for winter stores. It's beautiful, Tallulah breathed, running her hands along the smooth logs of the walls. Did you build it yourself? My mother and I built it together, Quinn said, then caught himself as if he'd revealed too much. Long time ago. The inside was sparse but clean, with a stone fireplace large enough to cook in and real glass windows that let in streams of golden light. Ayanna touched the rough-hewn table, the hand-carved chairs, the quilts folded neatly on the beds. Everything spoke of care, of someone who'd built this place to last. "The back room is yours," Quinn said, gesturing toward a doorway hung with a colorful blanket. "I've been using it for storage, but it's got good light and space for the children." Ayanna pushed aside the blanket and gasped. The room was filled with Cherokee artifacts, pottery, beadwork, ceremonial clothes, and woven baskets that looked exactly like ones her grandmother had made. On the far wall hung a painting of a Cherokee woman in traditional dress, her dark eyes holding the same gentle strength Ayanna remembered in her own grandmother's face. "Who was she?" Ayanna asked softly. Quinn appeared in the doorway behind her, his face shadowed with old pain. "My mother. Mary Stonecrow. She's beautiful. The painting it's incredibly detailed. She posed for a traveling artist when I was young. Said she wanted me to remember her face when she was gone." Quinn's voice grew rough. "She died of smallpox when I was 15. Tallulah slipped under her mother's arm to study the painting more closely. "She looks kind and sad." "She had reason to be sad," Quinn said. "Being Cherokee in this territory hasn't been easy." "Is that why you left?" Nahele asked from the doorway. "To find somewhere easier?" Quinn's jaw tightened. "Something like that." Over the following weeks, they settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Quinn left each morning for his mine, returning in the evenings with silver dust on his clothes and stories of underground caverns that glittered like starlight. Ayanna took over the cooking and mending, finding a strange contentment in caring for a home that didn't leak or threaten to blow away in the next strong wind. The children bloomed like desert flowers after rain. Tallulah discovered Quinn's small library and devoured every book, reading aloud to Nahele in the evenings while Quinn taught the boy to whittle and care for the horses. For the first time since William's death, laughter echoed regularly through their living space. But it was the quiet moments between Ayanna and Quinn that held the most danger and the most promise. He'd catch her eye across the dinner table and smile in a way that made her forget to breathe. She'd brush against him reaching for something and feel electricity spark between them. They were dancing around, an attraction that grew stronger every day, held back only by the weight of Quinn's unspoken secrets and Ayanna's fear of trusting her heart again. "Tell me about your husband," Quinn said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the children chase fireflies. "William was a good man," Ayanna said carefully. "Gentle. He married me when most white men wouldn't even look at a Cherokee woman, and he never once made me feel ashamed of who I was." "You loved him." "I did." She studied Quinn's profile in the fading light. "But love doesn't always last forever, and people have to keep living even after it's gone." Quinn turned to face her, something fierce and hopeful burning in his eyes. "And if someone was lucky enough to find love twice?" "Then they'd be blessed indeed," Ayanna whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. He leaned closer, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his dark eyes, smell the pine and leather scent of his skin. "Ayanna." "Mama!" Nahale's voice shattered the moment as he came running up the porch steps. "There's riders coming up the trail." Quinn was on his feet instantly, his hand moving instinctively to the gun at his hip. In the distance, Ayanna could see torches bobbing through the trees. Too many torches, moving too fast for friendly visitors. "Get inside," Quinn ordered, but his voice remained calm. "Take the children to the back room and stay quiet." "Who are they?" Tallulah asked, pressing close to her mother's side. "I don't know," Quinn lied, but Ayanna could see the recognition in his face. He knew exactly who was coming, and it terrified him. The riders emerged from the tree line like something out of a nightmare. A dozen men on horseback, torches held high, their faces hard and purposeful in the flickering light. At their head rode a man who commanded attention simply by existing, his silver hair catching the flame light and his pale eyes scanning the cabin like a predator sizing up prey. "Sequoia!" the man called out, his voice carrying easily across the meadow. "I know you're in there, boy. Time to come home." Ayanna felt Quinn stiffen beside her. "Sequoia? My Cherokee name," Quinn said quietly. "The one my mother gave me." "Sequoia Blackwater," the man called again, and this time there was steel in his voice. "Don't make me come in there and fetch you." Blackwater. The name hit Ayanna like a physical blow. She'd heard that name whispered in fear around reservation campfires, spoken of in the same breath as broken treaties and murdered families. Jeremiah Blackwater, the mine owner who'd built his fortune on Cherokee land stolen through legal trickery and violence. "You're his son," she breathed, the pieces falling together with horrible clarity. Quinn's face crumpled with shame and self-loathing. "Ayanna, I can explain. You're Jeremiah Blackwater's son." "Yes, but—" "The man who's been driving Cherokee families off their land for 20 years. The man who had my cousin's family killed when they wouldn't sell." "I'm not him," Quinn said desperately. "I've spent my whole adult life trying not to be him." But Ayanna was already backing away, her world tilting off its axis. Everything made sense now. The expensive clothes, the easy money, the way Quinn had known just a little too much about Cherokee customs without quite understanding their heart. He was Jeremiah Blackwater's half-breed son, the one rumored to have disappeared years ago rather than follow in his father's footsteps. "Mama?" Tallulah's voice was small and frightened. "What's happening?" Outside, Jeremiah Blackwater had dismounted and was walking toward the cabin with the confident stride of a man accustomed to getting his way. Even in the torchlight, Ayanna could see the resemblance between father and son. The same strong jaw, the same proud bearing, the same cold intelligence in their eyes. "5 minutes, Sequoia," Blackwater called out. "Then I'm coming in whether you like it or not." Quinn turned to Ayanna with naked desperation in his face. "I never told him about you. I swear on my mother's grave I never—" "But he knows now," Ayanna said flatly. "He followed you here. I can protect you, all of you. I have money, influence—" "You have blood," Ayanna interrupted. "Blackwater blood. And that makes you his whether you want to be or not." The truth of it hung between them like a blade. No matter how much Quinn might hate his father, no matter how hard he'd tried to escape his heritage, he was still Jeremiah Blackwater's son. And Jeremiah Blackwater had never let anything he considered his property slip from his grasp. 4 minutes, Blackwater shouted. Quinn straightened his shoulders, and for a moment Ayanna saw the man he must have been before guilt and shame bent him low. "I'll go with him," he said quietly. "I'll make a deal, my cooperation for your safety. And you think he'll honor that deal? He's my father. He's a killer." Quinn flinched as if she'd struck him. "I know what he is. But he's also the only family I have left." "That's not true," Nahali said suddenly from the doorway. The boy had been listening despite their efforts to shield him. "You have us?" "No, son," Quinn said gently. "I don't. Not anymore." Ayanna felt something break inside her chest. Not just her heart, but the careful hope she'd been building. For a few weeks she'd allowed herself to dream of safety, of love, of a future that stretched beyond mere survival. Now those dreams lay in ashes, destroyed by the same name that had haunted her people for decades. 3 minutes, boy. I'm getting impatient." Quinn moved toward the door, but Tallulah stepped into his path. "You're just going to leave? After everything?" "I don't have a choice." "There's always a choice," the 12-year-old said fiercely. That's what you taught me. There's always a choice between what's easy and what's right. Sometimes what's right gets good people killed, and sometimes what's easy does the same thing. Quinn stared down at the girl who'd become like a daughter to him, his face a mask of pain. I'm sorry, Tallulah. I'm sorry I wasn't the man you thought I was. You still could be, she whispered. But Quinn was already walking away, his shoulders set with grim determination. Ayanna watched him go and felt the last of her trust die. She'd been a fool to believe in fairy tales, to think that love could bridge the gap between Cherokee and white, between powerless and powerful, between truth and lies. Outside, she heard Quinn's voice calling out to his father, "I'm coming out! Don't hurt them!" The door opened and closed, and Quinn was gone, taking with him all the light and warmth he'd brought into their lives. Through the window, Ayanna watched father and son face each other in the torchlight, two figures locked in a dance of power and submission that was older than the mountains themselves. "We have to pack," she told her children quietly. "We can't stay here." "Where will we go?" Nahele asked. Ayanna looked around the cabin that had felt like home for such a brief, shining moment. At the Cherokee artifacts on the walls, the comfortable furniture, the books that Tallulah had been reading. All of it would have to be left behind, just like every other dream they'd ever dared to dream. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we'll figure it out. We always do." Outside, she could hear the sound of horses moving away, carrying Quinn back to the life he'd tried to escape. Soon the meadow would be empty except for the wind in the pines and the bitter taste of another broken promise. Ayanna began to gather their few belongings, her movements automatic and efficient. She'd done this before, packed up a life in the space between one heartbeat and the next, left behind everything that mattered because staying meant death, or worse. But this time felt different. This time, she wasn't just losing a home or a hope for the future. She was losing the man she'd started to love, the father her children had begun to trust, the dream of healing that had seemed so close she could taste it. As she folded their clothes into Quinn's saddlebags, he'd left his horse at least, Ayanna made herself a promise. Never again would she trust so easily, love so completely, hope so foolishly. The world was divided into those who had power and those who served them, and she'd been an idiot to think that love could change which side of that line you stood on. The Blackwaters of the world took what they wanted and kept what was theirs. And Quinn, no matter how much he might hate it, was theirs now and always had been. 3 days after Quinn left with his father, Ayanna and her children were back in their tent on the outskirts of Copper Falls. But everything had changed. The money Quinn had given them was gone. She'd thrown it into the creek rather than keep anything that came from Blackwater hands. Their brief taste of comfort made the return to poverty feel like swallowing broken glass. But worse than the physical hardship was the way the townspeople looked at them now. Word had spread quickly that the Cherokee woman and her children had been living with Jeremiah Blackwater's half-breed son. Some whispered that she'd been his mistress, others that she was a spy sent to gather information for the Cherokee resistance. The truth? That she'd simply fallen in love with a man who'd lied about who he was, seemed too mundane for the gossip mill. "Mrs. Whitehorse," Dr. Harrison called out as she walked past his office, her arms full of laundry she'd taken in to earn food money. "A word, if you please." Ayanna paused, her heart sinking. Dr. Harrison had been one of the few white men in Copper Falls who'd treated her with respect, even hiring her occasionally to translate for Cherokee patients. If he was turning against her too— "I've heard some troubling rumors," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "About your, association with the Blackwater family." "What association?" Ayanna kept her voice level. "I helped an injured man who lied about his name. That's all. That's all. That's all." Dr. Harrison studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. Good, because Jeremiah Blackwater is not a man whose attention you want to attract. His business dealings have left a lot of graves in their wake. I'm aware of his reputation. Are you aware that he's been asking questions about you? About your family history, your grandmother's land holdings? Cold dread settled in Ayanna's stomach. What kind of questions? The kind that usually come before legal papers get filed. He's been to the land office twice this week, going through old Cherokee treaties and allotment records. Dr. Harrison lowered his voice even further. Whatever connection you had to his son, Jeremiah seems to think you're worth investigating. That evening, as Ayanna tried to make a meal from their dwindling supplies, Tallulah burst into their tent with news that made her blood run cold. "Mama, there's a man at the general store asking about us. Mr. Peterson told him to mind his own business, but the man said he was working for Mr. Blackwater." What kind of questions was he asking? About grandmother's land? About whether we have any legal claim to it? Ayanna's hands stilled on the pot she'd been stirring. Her grandmother's land, 20 acres of seemingly worthless desert that had been allotted to her family back when the government was trying to break up tribal holdings. It had been in their family for 3 generations, passed down through the women because Cherokee inheritance followed the mother's line, but Ayanna hadn't thought about it in years. The land was too far from water to farm, too remote to build on, good for nothing but burial grounds and memories. "Why would Mr. Blackwater care about grandmother's land?" Nahele asked, looking up from the wooden horse he was carving. "I don't know," Ayanna lied, but her mind was racing. There had to be something valuable about that land, something worth Jeremiah Blackwater's attention. Mining rights, maybe? Or water access she didn't know about. The next morning brought unwelcome visitors. Ayanna was hanging laundry behind their tent when she heard horses approaching at a steady walk. Not the urgent gallop of messengers, but the deliberate pace of men with unpleasant business to conduct. "Mrs. Whitehorse," a gravelly voice called out. "We need to talk." She turned to see 3 men dismounting near their tent. A sheriff's deputy she didn't recognize, a thin man in a city suit who looked like a lawyer, and a third man whose gun belt and cold eyes marked him as hired muscle. "About what?" Ayanna asked, continuing to hang clothes as if her hands weren't shaking. "About trespassing," the deputy said, pulling out an official-looking document. "This here's a writ of eviction. You've got 24 hours to vacate this property. This is public land." "Not anymore." The lawyer stepped forward with the smug satisfaction of a man who enjoyed delivering bad news. "Mr. Blackwater has purchased this section from the territorial government. As of yesterday, you're camping on private property without permission." Ayanna felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "He can't do that." "He can, and he did." The lawyer handed her another set of papers. "These are the legal documents, all properly filed and recorded." Tallulah appeared at Ayanna's elbow, reading over the papers with the intensity she usually reserved for books. "Mama, look at the date on this purchase agreement. It's from last week after we came back from the cabin." The lawyer's smile grew sharper. "Mr. Blackwater moves quickly when he sees an opportunity." "What does he want?" Ayanna asked, though she suspected she already knew. "To discuss a business proposition. He's prepared to be generous in exchange for your cooperation on a certain matter." "What matter?" "Your grandmother's land allotment. Specifically, any documentation you might have regarding mineral rights or water access." There it was. The real reason behind Blackwater's sudden interest in their welfare. Somehow he'd discovered that her grandmother's worthless desert property held something valuable, and now he was using their desperate situation to force her hand. "I don't have any such documentation," Ayanna said truthfully. "My grandmother never mentioned minerals or water rights." "Perhaps not," the lawyer agreed, "but she might have mentioned other things. Burial sites, for instance." Sacred grounds. The kind of places the territorial government might be interested in preserving for historical purposes. Ayana's blood turned to ice. He was threatening to have her grandmother's burial ground declared a historical site, which would mean government oversight and restricted access. Her family would lose even the right to visit their ancestors' graves. "You have 24 hours to consider Mr. Blackwater's offer," the deputy said, remounting his horse. "After that, you'll be arrested for trespassing if you're still here." As the men rode away, Tallulah put a protective arm around her mother's shoulders. "What are we going to do?" Ayana stared at the legal papers in her hands, seeing her family's future crumble like dust between her fingers. They had no money for a lawyer, no political connections to fight Blackwater's influence, no friends powerful enough to stand against him. She was exactly where he wanted her, desperate, isolated, and cornered. "We're going to survive," she said finally, "just like we always have." But even as she spoke the words, Ayana wondered if this time might be different. This time they weren't just fighting poverty or prejudice or the casual cruelty of an indifferent world. They were fighting Jeremiah Blackwater, a man who'd built an empire on broken promises and buried bodies. That night, as her children slept fitfully in their tent, Ayana sat by their small fire and tried to make sense of their situation. Why did Blackwater want her grandmother's land so badly? What had he discovered that made 20 acres of desert worth manipulating and threatening a Cherokee widow? The answer came to her in fragments. Half-remembered stories her grandmother had told about the old days before the removals and the allotments. Stories about sacred springs that never ran dry, about caves where the ancestors had hidden treasures from Spanish conquistadors, about ceremonies performed in places where the veil between worlds grew thin. Her grandmother had been the last keeper of those stories, the last one who knew where the sacred places were hidden. And if those places were on allotted land, if they contained anything of value. "The water rights," Ayana whispered to herself, understanding flooding through her like cold mountain spring water. Her grandmother's land sat at the headwaters of the creek that fed the entire valley. Control the water source, control everything downstream, including Quinn's silver mine. Which meant Jeremiah Blackwater wasn't just after her grandmother's land for what it might contain, he was after it to control his own son. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Ayana made a decision that would either save her family or destroy them completely. She was going to find Quinn and tell him what his father was really planning, because if there was one thing she'd learned in their brief time together, it was that Quinn Stonecrow, or Sequoia Blackwater, or whatever name he chose to carry, was not the kind of man who liked being manipulated, even by his own father. The only question was whether he'd choose her family's welfare over his father's approval, and whether she could trust him enough to find out. As she packed their meager belongings for what might be the last time, Ayana found herself remembering something her grandmother used to say. "Sometimes the hardest battles are fought not with weapons, but with the truth." She was about to find out just how true those words really were. The journey to find Quinn took 2 days of hard riding on horses borrowed from Dr. Harrison, who'd pressed them into Ayana's hands with the grim comment that some fights are worth having even when you can't win them. Tallulah rode behind her mother, while Nahele managed his own mount with the fearless confidence of a boy who'd learned early that survival meant adapting quickly to whatever life threw at you. They found the Blackwater mining compound at sunset, a collection of rough buildings sprawled across a hillside like a scar on the mountain's face. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, and the sound of machinery echoed across the valley even at this late hour. This wasn't just a mine, it was a fortress, built by a man who understood that wealth made enemies. "How are we going to get in?" Tallulah whispered as they watched from the cover of pine trees. "We're not," Ayana said grimly. We're going to wait for Quinn to come out." But as the hours passed and full darkness settled over the mountains, it became clear that Quinn wasn't going anywhere. Through the compound's windows they could see lights burning in what looked like an office building. Occasionally, shadows moved past the glass, two figures locked in what appeared to be intense conversation. "He's arguing with his father," Naheli observed, with the matter-of-fact wisdom of a child who'd witnessed plenty of adult conflicts. "About what?" Tallulah asked. Ayanna had a sinking feeling she knew exactly what Jeremiah and Quinn were discussing. By now, Blackwater would have informed his son about the legal maneuvers against her family. He'd probably presented it as a simple business transaction: acquire the water rights, consolidate power, eliminate potential opposition. Clean and efficient, just like everything else in Jeremiah Blackwater's world. What she didn't know was how Quinn was responding to his father's plans. Near midnight, their wait ended. The office building's front door slammed open, and Quinn emerged like a man fleeing a fire, his face twisted with fury even in the dim light from the windows. He stalked toward the stables with long, angry strides, and Ayanna made her decision. "Stay here," she told the children. "No matter what happens, don't follow me." "Mama," Tallulah started to protest. "Promise me." The girl's face was pale with worry, but she nodded. "I promise." Ayanna slipped through the darkness toward the stables, her grandmother's teachings about moving silently through the forest serving her well. She reached the building just as Quinn led a saddled horse from its stall, his movements sharp with suppressed rage. "Going somewhere?" she asked quietly. Quinn spun around, his hand flying to his gun before recognition stopped him cold. "Ayanna, what in God's name are you doing here?" "Looking for answers. You shouldn't have come. It's not safe. Nowhere's safe when your father decides he wants something." She stepped into the lamplight, letting him see the exhaustion and determination in her face. "He's trying to steal my grandmother's land." Quinn's expression shifted from surprise to something that might have been shame. "I know. Do you? Do you know he's threatened to have my family arrested? Do you know he's planning to desecrate sacred burial grounds to get control of water rights?" "I know," Quinn said more forcefully. "That's why I'm leaving." "Running away again?" The words hit him like a physical blow. Quinn's face went white, then flushed with anger. "I'm not running. I'm trying to protect you." "By abandoning us to face your father alone? By removing the weapon he's using against you?" Quinn's voice rose, then he caught himself and lowered it again. "Don't you understand? As long as I'm here, as long as he thinks he can use me to control the mine and the water rights, he'll keep hurting you to get to me." Ayanna felt something cold settle in her chest. "And if you leave? He'll lose interest. You're only valuable to him as leverage against me. You think he'll just let us go?" Quinn hesitated, and in that hesitation, Ayanna saw the truth he didn't want to admit. Jeremiah Blackwater never let go of anything he considered his property, and he'd already invested too much effort in acquiring her family's land to simply walk away. "He gave me a choice," Quinn said finally. "Take over the family business, marry a woman of his choosing, and forget I ever knew you existed, or watch him destroy everything and everyone I care about." "And you chose?" "I chose you," Quinn said fiercely. "I told him to go to hell and take his empire with him." Despite everything, the lies, the betrayal, the impossible situation they found themselves in, Ayanna felt her heart lift at his words, but hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. "That's not enough," she said quietly. "What do you mean?" "Running away together, leaving him to his schemes, that's not enough. He'll just find other families to destroy, other people to crush. Your father has been terrorizing Cherokee families for 20 years, and it has to stop." Quinn stared at her as if she'd grown a second head. "You want to fight him?" Ayanna. He owns half the territorial government. He has more money than God and enough hired guns to start a war. And what does he not have? I don't understand. What does Jeremiah Blackwater not have that makes him so desperate to control you? Quinn was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Legitimacy, he said finally. Legal heir to pass his empire to. The mine is in my name because Cherokee blood quantum laws made it easier to acquire the original claims. If something happened to me, the inheritance would be complicated. Very complicated. Most of his holdings are tied up in shell companies and false partnerships to hide the illegal ways he acquired them. Without a clear legal heir, the territorial government would have grounds to investigate everything. Ayanna felt pieces of a plan beginning to form in her mind. And if that legal heir publicly renounced his inheritance, testified about how it was acquired, it would bring his whole empire crashing down, Quinn finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. But it would also make me a target for every hired gun in the territory. Maybe. Or maybe it would make you the most protected man in Arizona if you had the right allies. Before Quinn could respond, the sound of approaching horses shattered the night quiet. Multiple riders coming fast toward the stables. Quinn grabbed Ayanna's arm and pulled her deeper into the shadows just as a dozen armed men thundered into the compound's courtyard. "Search every building," a familiar voice commanded. "The half-breed's here somewhere and I want him found." Jeremiah Blackwater's voice carried clearly across the night air, filled with cold fury. "And find the Cherokee woman too. I know she's here." Ayanna's blood turned to ice. If Blackwater's men found Tallulah and Nahaley. "My children," she whispered. Quinn's face went hard as granite. "Where did you leave them?" "In the trees, about a quarter-mile east." "Can they take care of themselves?" "For a while, but if his men have tracking dogs." Quinn was already moving, leading his horse toward the stable's back exit. "We get them first, then we figure out how to end this." As they slipped through the darkness toward where her children waited, Ayanna realized that running was no longer an option for any of them. Jeremiah Blackwater had forced their hand by threatening what mattered most to her, her family's safety and her people's sacred places. The time for hiding and hoping for the best was over. Now it was time to fight, even if it meant risking everything they had left. Behind them, shouts echoed through the mining compound as Blackwater's men searched for their prey. Ahead lay the uncertain safety of the forest and the even more uncertain prospect of taking on one of the most powerful men in the territory. But as they reached the tree line and heard Tallulah's whispered, "Mama," in the darkness, Ayanna felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The fierce certainty that came from knowing exactly what you were fighting for. Her children, her heritage, the truth. And maybe, if they were very lucky and very careful, a chance at the kind of love that could survive anything, even a war with Jeremiah Blackwater. They rode hard through the night, Quinn leading them along mountain trails that seemed to exist only in his memory. Behind them, torches bobbed through the darkness like angry stars as Blackwater's men gave chase, their shouts echoing off canyon walls. Tallulah clung to her mother's waist, while Nahaley rode beside Quinn with the grim determination of a boy forced to grow up too fast. "Where are we going?" Ayanna called over the thunder of hoofbeats. "The old Cherokee settlement," Quinn shouted back. "Your grandmother's land. If we're going to make a stand, it should be on sacred ground." The irony wasn't lost on her. They were fleeing to the very place Jeremiah Blackwater wanted to steal, the 20 acres of seemingly worthless desert that had somehow become the center of a war between past and future, between Cherokee heritage and white greed. They reached the ancient burial ground just as dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of blood and gold. The land looked exactly as Ayanna remembered from childhood visits with her grandmother: scrub brush and red earth, a few stunted trees clinging to life around a natural spring that bubbled up from deep underground. Nothing that should have attracted Jeremiah Blackwater's attention, yet something important enough to risk everything for. There, Quinn pointed to a cluster of rocks near the spring. Your grandmother showed me that place once when I was young, said it was where the old ones kept their most precious things safe. Ayanna felt her heart stop. You knew my grandmother? Quinn's face crumpled with shame and memory. Mary Stonecrow was my mother's name, but before she married my father, she was Mary Whitehorse, your grandmother's sister. The world tilted beneath Ayanna's feet. You're my cousin. Second cousin, technically. But yes. Quinn couldn't meet her eyes. I recognized you the moment I saw you in the desert. You look exactly like our grandmother did at your age. Tallulah was staring between them with the wide eyes of a child trying to process information that changed everything. So, we really are family? We've always been family, Quinn said quietly. I was too ashamed to admit it. Ashamed of being Cherokee? Nahale asked with the blunt honesty that children wielded like weapons. Ashamed of abandoning my people when they needed me most. Quinn dismounted and helped the children down from their horses. When my mother died, I could have stayed with the Cherokee families, learned our ways properly. Instead, I let my father convince me that white society was the only path to success. But you came back, Ayanna said, understanding beginning to dawn. You've been protecting Cherokee families all along, haven't you? The silver mine, the money you've been spending to help people. It's all been your way of trying to make amends. Quinn nodded miserably. I've been buying up land and water rights before my father could get to them, then selling them back to Cherokee families for nothing. But it was never enough. Every family he destroyed, every sacred site he desecrated, I felt like I had blood on my hands. The sound of approaching horses cut short their reunion. Blackwater's men had found their trail, and they were closing fast. Quinn grabbed a rifle from his saddle and checked his ammunition, while Ayanna gathered her children close. How many bullets do you have? She asked. Enough for maybe half of them. After that? Quinn shrugged grimly. After that, we trust in the old ways, Ayanna said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. She knelt by the sacred spring and placed her hands in the cold, clear water. Grandmother, if you can hear me, we need help. The first riders appeared over the ridge like harbingers of doom, Jeremiah Blackwater at their head, his pale eyes scanning the landscape with the cold calculation of a predator sizing up its prey. He rode slowly down the slope, confident in his numbers and his power, savoring the moment of his inevitable victory. "Sequoia!" he called out when he was close enough to be heard clearly. "You've led me quite a chase, boy, but every trail ends somewhere." Quinn stepped forward, placing himself between his father and Ayanna's family. "This is Cherokee land, Father. You have no authority here." Blackwater laughed, the sound as harsh as grinding metal. "I have 12 armed men and legal documents giving me ownership of this entire section. That's all the authority I need. Those documents are forgeries. Prove it in court." Blackwater's smile was razor sharp. "Oh, wait. You can't." "Because you'll be dead." Ayanna felt rage build in her chest like wildfire. This man had destroyed her people for decades, stolen their land, murdered their families, all with the smug confidence of someone who knew the system would always protect him. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd threatened her children. "Tell me something, Jeremiah," she called out, rising from beside the spring. "Do you know what this place really is? 20 acres of worthless desert that I'm about to own. The headwaters of every creek and river in this valley. The source of all the water that feeds your mines, your towns, your empire. Ayanna walked forward until she stood beside Quinn, her head held high with Cherokee pride. My grandmother didn't just own this land, she controlled the water rights for the entire territory. Blackwater's confidence flickered for the first time. That's impossible. Is it? Check your territorial water law. Original Cherokee treaties supersede all later claims, and this spring has been in Cherokee hands since before your kind ever set foot in Arizona. Quinn was staring at her with something like awe. The old Spanish land grants. Your grandmother never mentioned, because she was waiting for the right time. Ayanna reached into her dress and pulled out a leather pouch she'd carried since childhood, something her grandmother had given her with strict instructions to guard with her life. The right moment to use this. She opened the pouch and withdrew a rolled document, yellow with age but still legible. The Spanish words were faded but clear, and at the bottom was a seal that had been impressed into the parchment itself. A Spanish land grant from 1798, she announced, loud enough for all of Blackwater's men to hear, giving my great-great-grandmother perpetual water rights to all sources within a 50-mile radius of this spring, validated by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and protected by territorial law. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Blackwater's hired guns seemed to understand that they were witnessing something that changed everything. That document is worthless, Blackwater snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. Then you won't mind if I take it to the territorial governor, Ayanna replied calmly, along with testimony about how you've been illegally claiming water rights for 20 years. You wouldn't dare! Watch me. For a moment, father and son faced each other across 20 yards of sacred ground, the weight of decades pressing down between them. Then Blackwater drew his gun. I've built an empire on this land, he said quietly. I won't let a half-breed woman and her bastard children destroy it. Quinn moved faster than Ayanna had thought possible, his own weapon clearing leather in a smooth motion that spoke of years of practice. But he didn't aim at his father. Instead, he pointed his gun at the ground between them. Enough, he said firmly. This ends now. You won't shoot your own father. You're right, Quinn agreed, but I'll do something worse. I'll tell the truth. He raised his voice so it carried across the entire gathering. Jeremiah Blackwater murdered my mother when I was 15 years old. Poisoned her because she was going to expose his illegal land deals to the territorial authorities. I've been gathering evidence for 20 years, waiting for the courage to use it. Ayanna saw several of Blackwater's men exchange uncertain glances. These were hired guns, not murderers. There was a difference, and they all knew it. He's lying, Blackwater snapped, but sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Am I? Quinn reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a thick folder. Financial records, correspondence, witness statements. Everything I need to prove that the Blackwater Empire was built on murder and theft. You have no proof. I have her diary, Quinn interrupted, his voice breaking slightly. My mother wrote down everything. Every bribe, every threat, every family that disappeared after refusing to sell their land. She documented it all because she knew someone would need the truth someday. The folder hit the ground between them like a gauntlet, pages scattering in the morning breeze. Financial documents, letters in Jeremiah's handwriting, maps showing land acquisitions that followed suspicious deaths, 20 years of evidence blowing across sacred Cherokee ground. Blackwater stared at the scattered papers, his face cycling through rage, fear, and something that might have been defeat. Then he looked up at his son with eyes that held nothing but cold hatred. You would destroy your own father for these people? I would honor my mother's memory, Quinn replied quietly. And protect my family. The word family hung in the air like a prayer. Jeremiah Blackwater's empire had been built on breaking families, scattering tribes, destroying the bonds that held communities together. But here, on this sacred ground, family had found a way to heal itself. Ayanna reached out and took Quinn's free hand, feeling the calluses earned through years of honest work. Tallulah and Nahelu moved to stand beside them, four people bound by blood and choice and something stronger than either. Jeremiah Blackwater looked at them for a long moment, then slowly holstered his gun. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode away, his men following in uncomfortable silence. They left behind the scattered documents that would eventually bring down an empire, rebuild Cherokee communities, and restore sacred lands to their rightful guardians. But more importantly, they left behind a family that had finally found its way home. 6 months later, Ayanna stood in the doorway of the new schoolhouse built beside the sacred spring, watching her children help younger Cherokee students with their lessons. The building was simple but solid, constructed with lumber donated by Quinn and labor provided by families who'd returned to reclaim their ancestral lands. Sunlight streamed through real glass windows, illuminating pages where Cherokee and English words lived side by side. "The territorial governor wants to meet with you next week," Quinn said, appearing beside her with a letter in his hand. Something about establishing a Cherokee cultural preserve. Ayanna took the letter, marveling at how much had changed since that terrible morning when everything seemed lost. The evidence Quinn had preserved about his father's crimes had indeed brought down an empire. Jeremiah Blackwater sat in a territorial prison awaiting trial for murder, fraud, and conspiracy. His stolen lands were being returned to their rightful owners, his illegal water claims voided, his network of corrupt officials exposed and prosecuted. "Hard to believe sometimes," she murmured, watching Tallulah patiently explain fractions to a group of wide-eyed 6-year-olds. "6 months ago we were sleeping in a tent and counting beans." "Hard times don't last," Quinn said, echoing her grandmother's favorite saying. "Hard people do." The phrase had become something of a motto for their growing community. Families were returning from reservations and failed homesteads, drawn by word that Cherokee land was Cherokee again. They came with nothing but hope and left with homes, jobs, and the dignity that came from belonging somewhere. Quinn had surprised everyone by refusing to claim his father's mining empire. Instead, he'd turned the evidence over to tribal leaders and territorial authorities, keeping only enough money to fund the school and help returning families get established. The rest, the mines, the land, the accumulated wealth of 20 years' theft, had been placed in trust for Cherokee communities throughout the territory. "I never wanted his money," Quinn had told the Territorial Commission. "I only wanted to stop him from hurting people." Now he worked as a translator and advocate, helping Cherokee families navigate the legal system that had been used against them for so long. It was quiet work, unglamorous work, but it meant former enemies were becoming neighbors, and ancient wounds were finally beginning to heal. "Mama!" Nahel called from across the schoolyard where he was teaching younger boys to carve. "Uncle Quinn, come see what Tommy made." Uncle Quinn. The title had stuck despite their attempts to explain the actual family relationship. To the children of their community, Quinn was simply the man who'd helped bring their families home, and that made him kin regardless of blood. They walked over to admire Tommy's wooden horse, detailed down to flowing mane and proud stance. The boy beamed with pride as Quinn examined his work with the serious attention of a master craftsman. "This is fine work," Quinn pronounced. "Your grandfather would be proud." Tommy's grandfather had been one of Jeremiah Blackwater's victims, murdered for refusing to sell his land rights. But instead of letting grief consume him, the boy had channeled his loss into creating beautiful things, a lesson that seemed to define their entire community's approach to healing. Speaking of grandfathers, Ayanna said quietly, taking Quinn's arm as they walked toward the spring. I've been thinking about names. Quinn raised an eyebrow. What kind of names? The kind you give babies. Quinn stopped walking so abruptly that Ayanna had to catch his arm to keep from stumbling. His face cycled through surprise, joy, and terror in the space of a heartbeat. Babies? Baby, she corrected with a smile. Just one, at least for now. Quinn's whoop of joy startled a flock of quail from the nearby brush and brought Tallulah and Nahele running to see what had happened. When they learned they were going to have a little brother or sister, their excitement was loud enough to wake the ancestors. Can we name it after great-grandmother? Tallulah asked, practical as always. If it's a girl, Ayanna agreed. And if it's a boy? William, Nahele said without hesitation. After Papa, so the baby knows where he came from. Quinn's eyes filled with tears at the boy's matter-of-fact inclusion of him in their family history. William Stonecrow Whitehorse, he said softly. That's a name with weight to it. All names have weight, Ayanna said, placing her hand over her still flat belly. The question is whether they're a burden or a gift. That evening, as the sun set over the mountains and painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, the extended family gathered around their dinner table. Dr. Harrison had ridden out from Copper Falls to check on a patient and stayed for Ayanna's cooking. Mrs. Peterson and her daughters had come to deliver supplies for the school and lingered to hear Quinn's stories about life in the mining camps. Even Sheriff Martinez, the new sheriff, elected after Blackwater's corruption network collapsed, had stopped by to discuss security for an upcoming Cherokee gathering. The house they'd built together wasn't large, but it was filled with laughter and conversation in 3 languages. Cherokee elders shared traditional stories while their grandchildren translated for white neighbors. Former enemies compared farming techniques and debated the territorial legislature's latest decisions. Children played games that mixed Cherokee traditions with Mexican customs and Anglo innovations. This is what your grandmother dreamed of, Quinn told Ayanna as they watched the mingled group around their table. A place where people could be themselves without having to choose between old ways and new ones. She'd love seeing Tallulah teach reading in Cherokee, Ayanna agreed. And Nahele learning silversmithing from your mother's tools. Quinn had found his mother's jewelry-making supplies in the cabin's storage room and taught the boy to work with silver and turquoise. Nahele's first creation had been a bracelet for his mother, inlaid with stones that caught the light like captured starfire. Have you decided what to do about the territorial government's offer? Dr. Harrison asked during a lull in conversation. The offer was generous. Official recognition of Cherokee sovereignty over the sacred lands, funding for schools and medical facilities, legal protection for traditional practices. In exchange, the Cherokee community would serve as a model for territorial policy toward indigenous peoples. Other tribes were watching to see if cooperation could succeed where resistance had failed. The elders are still discussing it, Ayanna said diplomatically. It's a big decision. It's the right decision, Tallulah said with the conviction of youth. Grandmother always said you have to plant seeds if you want to harvest hope. Wise words from a wise girl, Sheriff Martinez agreed, though I suspect she gets that wisdom from her mother. Ayanna felt warmth spread through her chest at the compliment. 6 months ago, these same people had viewed her family with suspicion and pity. Now they spoke of her children with respect and affection, seeking their opinions on matters that affected the entire community. As the evening wound down and guests began preparing to leave, Quinn pulled Ayanna aside on the porch where they'd first talked about trust and second chances. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small leather pouch. Something I've been working on. Inside the pouch lay a ring unlike anything Ayanna had ever seen. The band was silver, worked in traditional Cherokee patterns, but set with a stone that seemed to capture all the colors of desert sunset. deep red fading to gold with veins of turquoise that reminded her of sacred springs. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Where did you find such a stone?" "From your grandmother's land, near the spring where you found the Spanish documents." Quinn's voice was soft with memory. "Your grandmother showed it to me when I was young, said it was a sign that some things are worth waiting for." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Ayanna thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. The pain and loss, the mistakes and misunderstandings, the courage required to choose love over fear and truth over comfort. "Sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing," she said, echoing the words that had started their journey. "And sometimes," Quinn replied, pulling her close as their children's laughter drifted through the open windows, "the right thing turns out to be the most beautiful thing of all." Above them, the desert stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, blessing a family that had found its way home at last. Sometimes the most beautiful stories remind us that it's never too late for a second chance at happiness. In A Beggar Woman and Her Kids Saved a Dying Cowboy, we witnessed Ayanna Whitehorse transform from a desperate widow counting her last 3 beans to a woman who found love, purpose, and belonging again. Her journey speaks to every heart that has known loss, the fear that our best days are behind us, that we're too broken to be loved, or that starting over means betraying the memory of what we've lost. But Ayanna's story proves that love doesn't replace what we've lost. It builds upon it. When she placed her grandmother's ring alongside her new wedding band, she wasn't choosing between past and future. She was honoring both. Her children didn't lose their father's memory when they gained Quinn as a father figure. They gained a richer understanding of what family really means. The sacred spring that had seemed worthless became the source of new life for an entire community. Sometimes what we think is our ending is actually our beginning. Sometimes the hardest thing, trusting again, loving again, hoping again, is exactly what our hearts need to bloom like desert flowers after rain. What moment in your own life taught you that second chances can be more beautiful than first ones? Have you ever discovered that something you thought was lost forever actually led you to something even better? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.